as I was mentioning earlier, was going to be a larger session about Fedora and integrating with Fedora, but unfortunately, Iran wasn't able to make it, so it's just me. Um, and I'm going to be discussing and really sharing some thoughts and ideas to get some reaction and responses and thoughts about what others think of these ideas. So I'm not here to offer solutions, but rather some ideas and get reactions on that. What sparked this was actually an article that I saw posted on the Code for Lib Slack, which apparently this was born out of a Code for Lib presentation at the Code for Lib conference called OCFL and the Source of Truth: Two Options, where they discuss these ideas of whether or not your preservation repository would be the source of truth for that repository in terms of access and use, or off to the side. Now they're talking, this post was written in the context of OCFL, which is the Oxford Common File Layout. Fedora uses this under the hood. So for the purposes of this discussion, even if you go read the article, it's a good article. I suggest you go read it. But for our purposes, I'm kind of using these two synonymously. They're not synonymous, but for our purposes, it's close enough for this. So what do they mean by off to the side in this article? When they're talking about your preservation repository being off to the side, so you might write an application that more or less uses standard architectures for writing, like web applications such as Drupal, or some other web framework, whatever it might be, Ruby on Rails, like the Samvera folks do, or something else. Then the data is mirrored to OCFL, in our case, Fedora, as a backup in a specific standard format. So it's specifically, you're taking content that's in a web application and sticking it somewhere for preservation. That's this off to the side idea. Versus the source of truth idea is that that is the primary location of your data. So you might have software that wants to add, remove, or change data, and it'll probably happen to Fedora first, which may or may not be the case, but at any rate, it's not considered successful until it shows up at the preservation repository. So this was the context of these two ideas of a digital preservation repository being off to the side of your application or the source of truth. Now, early on in the discussion, so these quotes come from the Islandora Tech Call minutes of November 25th, 2015. This was before I joined this project by a good 2 years before I even saw, the initial claw development of the new Islandora. And they had this discussion. I don't think anyone in here was there, perhaps, but I think Donald Moses was in that meeting in the attendees list for this meeting. So there are other people still engaged in the community that were part of this discussion. But the section title for this part of the discussion was, who's the master here? Is it Drupal or is it Fedora? And they need to define or choose which side of the stack will be considered as master in terms of the sync. So they were really discussing this idea of source of truth versus off to the side, even though they weren't using that terminology. And they stated Fedora as the main storage system was the ideal because the main idea of having a repository is to make use of it. And that Drupal is a good way of caching local resources. So it sounds like what they were aiming for was Fedora as source of truth for this new version of Islandora. And this is actually where our fly system set up part of this. So to give a bit more context about how we do it, Fly system is just a PHP library for abstracting file systems. That's what Fly system does. We wrote a Fly system adapter for Fedora. So you could have a Fly system adapter that looks at S3. You could have one that looks like at a zip file. You can have one that looks at any type of file system type structure. We wrote one to say, hey, treat Fedora as a file system so it can save stuff there. So when you send a file to Drupal, instead of having Drupal write it to the local hard disk, it sends it to Fedora instead over HTTP. And Drupal allows us to define a file system. By default, it provides a public file system, which is just a directory, and also a private one, which is a hidden directory that's not instantly accessible to like your Apache or your Nginx. Drupal supports multiple, but the UI is really focused on having one of them. You either do public or you do private, or in our case, you do Fedora using the UI. You can run multiple at the same time. You can say explicitly in code, this is where I want stuff to go. But whenever you're setting like the media settings for where should you upload a file, it's going to say, hey, put it in this one file system. Not, let's choose which file system you want when you upload something, right? And that's why, what I mean when I say it prefers one. It wants you to set one and use it, not multiple, even though a lot of us do behind the scenes. For metadata, how we ended up doing this sync was using Milner, which is a slightly different process. So instead of having a library that abstracts the file system, we are using an asynchronous setup, where when you do something in Drupal to a metadata record, it goes to our queue, and then Milner says, okay, I'm going to index this thing, grabs the metadata, which does a number of magical things to it, before dropping it in Fedora. So unlike Fly System, which is synchronous, it happens on the request right away. Milner is asynchronous and is relying on this queue. And note, this is a one-way trip. It ends at Fedora. It doesn't go back to Drupal at all in terms of either metadata updates or even a notification, right? And that's been one of the issues that we'll talk later with this. So this idea that as Islandora using Fedora as source of truth would be you would start in Drupal, push stuff to Fedora, and it would come back. This was the ideal, but it never fully materialized. Because only by this, the Milner part is really just a one-way street. So when you ask, is Islandora using Fedora as the source of truth or off to the side? The answer is both, right? Because we're using Fly System as a source of truth structure, but our metadata is all off to the side in practicality. Now, that might be fine. Like, if you're happy with it, that challenges that I've come across or I've heard others report that are issues with issues with failures on the site when it starts hitting stuff in our Fedora, downloading original files that are in our Fedora instances, because it couldn't keep up for one reason or another. And this is with two separate configurations. UNLV was using Apache, and we had an issue with temporary disk filling up because we had some large video masters, and the temp space couldn't fit multiple large items at a time. Filled up the system disk, boom. ASUs, it consumed all the memory as it was caching these resources. other than, you know, slowing down the crawlers through a variety of means, like using Cloudflare and etc. to say, hey, limit your rates of crawling us. Um, and also difficulty with large files. Both ASU especially has had issues where we haven't been able to use Fly System to upload anything larger than 4 gigs in size. Which, if you know digitized video, is much bigger in often cases than that. Um, and again, UNLV, a temporary disk space, if you didn't have a large enough temp spot, also had issues. So part of it is configuration, part of it is we haven't found the right configuration to make it work effectively there. And part of this is because Drupal is acting like a resource-intensive proxy for files. So if you look at the different file systems that we get in Drupal with Islandora, the public file is really, really quick because how the Drupal is set up, it doesn't even need to talk to Fedora to get stuff in the public file system. That's just handled by either Apache or Nginx. Super fast because those servers are built to return stuff quickly. The private file system is a little bit slower because you have to, what's referred to as bootstrapping Drupal. You have to start up the PHP process. It has to load all the Drupal code. It has to load all the modules. It has to load all the settings from the database, and then go through the access checks to make sure that you can get the thing before it returns it. So it's a little bit slower depending on your configuration than just doing, or a lot slower depending on your Drupal install and how you have it set up. But then Fly System, you have this additional layer of going across the wire to Fedora, bringing it back. And if you have your Fedora and your Drupal on separate boxes, separated by a network connection, do you have a fat enough pipe to bring it across? You can see why it gets more and more expensive as you go down this tree to do this. The challenges with the metadata side is that indexing tends to be opaque because it's off to a queue, and most of us aren't monitoring those queues very well. With the exception of UTSC is using advanced queue, which is making reporting indexing failures much easier to be able to. So that's great work. I like what you guys have done with that to help relieve this part of the problem that we have of knowing whether or not it's actually in Fedora or not, right? But the other challenge, which I think is another significant problem for using Fedora as a preservation repository, is that the metadata representations are problematic for round tripping the metadata, or for future, if you wanted to scrape out your repository and populate a new access system representing the metadata in the same way that we have it in Drupal from the Fedora, because it's the internal Drupal structure is much different from the RDF that it produces. And to give you an idea of how this shows up, I have one object, 2 different representations, and these are, of course, like not all the fields, just like an idea of what we have. On the left is a Drupal item, starting at a collection to a complex object parent, to a complex object page, to the actual median file there. Starting with the ASU School of Performance archive, which has a node ID and a UUID, which may surprise some people who have used it because Drupal does not show people this UUID ever, unless you're doing system administration stuff is when you tend to see those. And the string quartet recital has its own node ID, which references member of the parent, right? So as long as you start at the bottom of the stack, you can follow your way back up. We have other tricks that we've used for reversing this for our displays, so we can make it work. Although stay tuned, because at the end of the week, there's going to be that discussion about reversing this relationship, which I'm interested in attending to see how that goes. But That's how it's set up, and it works okay. But when this is indexed in Fedora, you'll notice that the primary URI is based off of the UUID, right? Um, and if you want to go to the string quartet recital, it has another Fedora URI, but it doesn't reference the parent item's URI in Fedora. So if you were trying to rebuild your repository structure from the Fedora, you would have to start referencing this schema same as URIs with the Drupal URL to find the Fedora one. It's a bit awkward, right? To find these relationships purely based off of the Fedora RDF, because we're not referencing other items by their Fedora URI. We're referencing it by the Drupal URL, right? So it's a bit awkward in that way. It gets worse though. So on the left here we have Drupal data in JSON. Roughly, it's okay. Drupal stores it as internally as relational database tables, right? But when you look at it in terms of the programming interface, it's basically boiled down to a JSON structure, right? And that's how I've serialized it here. You'll also notice that I have two entities up here, both the node and also a paragraph. Now, we don't do paragraphs in Drupal right now for Islandora in most cases. This is something that some sites are starting to use. ASU pioneered using paragraphs as part of their metadata. But the reason being is it allows us even more complex structures than Drupal fields without hard coding a lot of things. So for example, the typed relationship field was a way of hard coding the ability to have a relator type and entity reference. You can do the same thing in paragraphs with config, essentially. You do still need to write some code for like the RDF serialization, but it can abstract some of this bit. The reason why ASU did this with title, you'll notice that a title has multiple parts. You have the non-sort value, you have the main title, and you have the field subtitle. That's from mods. That's basically what they were doing, is they were trying to recreate the mod structure of a title info element right there, which is the rationale for using the paragraph. But it means we have two separate entities that need to be serialized here. In Islandora, we use RDF mappings to say this field should use this RDF predicate, right? And so here we have our, and again, the that we use to further alter what ASU decided to use both DSER terms, created and that was before my time, but it's something you can do. You can say, hey, this element has two predicates because they kind of mean the same thing. And then also ASU wrote their own processors for the paragraph to say, hey, take this complex title and serialize it like this for your RDF. So if you take your Drupal data, run through the RDF mapping, and these magical hook alterations that we have, you get JSON LD at the other end. And this is what Milner grabs from you, for you, from Drupal. So on the left, we have what is the JSON LD for the EDT update created, where we actually have like 4 values here now. Because again, magical hooks, adding stuff. We have our DC terms created with a string value and a schema date, XML schema date, and we have the mods date created with a string and XML schema date. Again, because we opted to have 2 predicates, but then we also changed it to do some type identification there. Linked agent, similarly, everything is going to be a contributor, so it's going to list all the taxonomy terms referenced for each of the contributors, but it's also going to add pull that relator So in this case, we have a performers, and we have a publisher one as well. Fields, right? In at least the standard profile duplicating in some cases. Same thing with the contributors and the relators. Do you just know that if you have a contributor, it goes into this particular field, and then you have to go in right about what does it mean to have preservation and what does it mean if we don't have Fedora, et cetera, et cetera. So that becomes a much larger conversation. Now, if we don't want to get rid of Fedora, what could we do? How could we make this perhaps a little bit better? One of the things that we could do is finish making Fedora the source of truth, which would mean improving our metadata, right? How the metadata gets to Fedora and how we can bring it back into Drupal if we wanted to. Either improving the RDF module, how it works right now, which is actually moving from core into contrib. So hopefully that means that they'll listen to us a bit more closely when we suggest updates. You don't know what's going to happen with that. So it preserves Drupal's richer structure. And as a note, there's a lot of alternate JSON LD options out there. I have not evaluated any of these, but I know one of them, at least, Rosie posted to Slack about because she came across it at DrupalCon, that has a lot of support for paragraphs and things like that to do these richer structures. Might be interesting. You'd still need to map the JSON LD back to the Drupal entities, so this would be a topic for exploration if we wanted to go down that road. The other option is to just export the JSON object from Drupal and slap it into Fedora as a binary resource. That has been suggested in the past for mods that come from Islandora 7, basically doing the same sort of thing where I just take it as a binary and not worry about RDF. It'll go into Fedora and we can pull it back and drop it back into our Drupal, whatever it is. That means that you're probably not doing any processing of that metadata in Fedora to bring it back. Otherwise, you're going to have to teach that tool to understand Drupal's data structures to do that. But yeah, could, possibly. All that said, I'm not convinced that any of these will necessarily be more effective, and there would still be a whole lot of legwork to get this whole process to work. So I'm not wholly convinced that completing the task of making Fedora source of truth is a practical option, especially if you're still having troubles with file system. Right? If that is still an issue, that's still gonna be an issue. We could consider, well, what does Islandora look like if Fedora is off to the side, right, as an alternative? as I mentioned already, metadata is already off to the side. It could certainly use the metadata improvements that would possibly come from doing this or the RDF module revamp, right? So we could still get some benefits out of that. But for setting the binaries off to the side, we could just embrace Fedora's external content. Because Fedora knows how to talk to things that aren't physically stored in the Fedora OCFL. And actually the OCFL is, community is talking about extensions to OCFL that would natively support external content. So Fedora has some workarounds for the fact that it doesn't right now, but they bring it in. They're going to talking about making that an official part of the OCFL spec. But we could just embrace that and say, hey, Fedora, you know that this file lives in Drupal public file system, right? That's where it is. Go do your fixity checking on it there, rather than enforcing a local copy on Fedora's disk, right? Or we could use Fly System to duplicate the file into Fedora. Duplication is not always a bad thing. In fact, if you look at the NDSA levels of preservation, duplication is great as long as it's managed duplication. You know where the various copies are, right? If you wanted to go even further afield with off to the side from what we have, you could do something like what Islandora-Fedora does and export the images and the media JSON and the node JSON and the mods XML, package it up and throw this into Fedora. A possible option, right? For being able to manage this. And like I said, there's lots of things that we could do, and these are not recommendations by any means. They're just thoughts and ideas. So I'm interested in yours, and this is recorded. So preference, would people rather have this conversation recorded or not? I'm fine with stopping the recording here if people don't want to be on recording. If you don't mind and we can keep recording, I can pass around the